The day Evelyn Carter bought her father's house from his estate for $1, 3 people told her she was making a mistake. The realtor called it a money pit. Her younger brother said she'd regret it within a month, and the neighbor across the street actually laughed when Evelyn signed the papers. "Evelyn," he said, shaking his head, "your father spent decades trying to keep that place from falling apart." Evelyn looked through the office window at the faded 2-story house, peeling siding, cracked windows, a porch that sagged toward the yard. She looked down at the deed in her hand. "I know." What none of them knew was that Evelyn hadn't taken the house because she thought it was worth anything. 3 days before Thomas Carter died, he had asked her a strange question. He was lying in a hospital bed, too weak to sit up without help. He took Evelyn's hand. "Did you ever notice the wall beside my workshop?" She smiled. "No, Dad." "Why?" His expression changed. "If you ever own that house, don't let anyone tear that wall apart." "Why?" Thomas looked toward the window. "Because I didn't build what's behind it." Evelyn thought he was confused. 2 days later, Thomas was gone. A week after the funeral, she discovered what he had meant. She was cleaning the workshop when an old wooden shelf refused to move. She pulled harder. The shelf shifted. Behind it was a narrow strip of paint that didn't match the rest of the wall. Evelyn scraped at it with a screwdriver. A seam appeared, then a wooden frame, then a brass handle. She stopped. There was already a door leading from the workshop into the hallway. This was another one. A second door. She remembered her father's warning. Evelyn reached for the handle. It turned. The door opened 2 inches before striking something. She pushed again. Wood scraped against wood. Then whatever was behind it shifted. The door opened. Behind it was a narrow room with no window, no electrical outlet, no light fixture, just a workbench, a metal filing cabinet, and shelves covered in dust. Evelyn stayed in the doorway. Above the workbench hung an old photograph. 3 men stood outside a factory. She recognized her father. The second man took her longer. Then she remembered an old newspaper photograph. Samuel Reed. The man blamed for a factory accident that killed 2 workers in 1979. Evelyn turned the photograph over. 4 words had been written across the back. "Samuel built this room." She read it again. Her father hadn't built the room. Samuel had. But why would a man blamed for 2 deaths construct a hidden room in his own house just days after the accident? And what had he needed to preserve badly enough to hide it? Evelyn stepped inside. There was no money, no jewelry, no weapon. The room contained records, factory inspection sheets, old newspaper clippings, property documents, photographs. And beneath the workbench, she found a small brass plate. She wiped away the dust. Stamped into the metal were the words, "Room completed. October 21st, 1979. Evelyn checked the newspaper clipping again. The accident had occurred on October 14th, 7 days earlier. She opened the filing cabinet. The first drawer contained newspaper articles. The second held factory maintenance records. The third contained handwritten notes. The fourth was empty. One folder was marked, October 1979. Inside was a preserved copy of a safety warning. It stated that a pressure valve on one of the factory's main machines required immediate replacement. At the bottom was a notation, "Received, S. Reed." The date was October 12th, 2 days before the accident. Evelyn found the official newspaper account. The story was simple. Samuel Reed had received the warning. The equipment had remained in operation. 2 workers had died. The factory had blamed Samuel. The town had believed the factory. Samuel had left town. But one detail bothered her. The article said investigators had examined the original warning. Yet the surviving case file contained only a copy. The original was missing. Then she found a maintenance report. It stated that the damaged valve had been repaired on October 13th. the day before the accident. The signature belonged to Frank Delaney, the factory's operations manager. Evelyn laid the documents side by side. Warning, received October 12th. Repair supposedly completed October 13th. Accident, October 14th. The timeline looked neat, almost too neat. Then she found a handwritten note from Thomas. Only 4 words. Samuel knew more than he admitted. Evelyn stared at the page. Maybe the town had been wrong about Samuel. Or maybe her father had spent decades protecting a man who knew exactly what had happened. For the first time, she wasn't sure whether the hidden room contained evidence of Samuel's innocence. It might contain evidence of his guilt. The next morning, Evelyn went to the county courthouse. She requested the original property records. The house had belonged to Samuel Reed from 1976 until 1981. That confirmed one thing. Samuel had owned the house when the hidden room was constructed, but the records revealed something else. Samuel had sold the property in 1981 to a local attorney named Martin Hale. The recorded price was $1. 3 years later, Martin Hale transferred the house to Thomas Carter. Again, the recorded price was $1. Evelyn stared at the deeds. There had to be a reason. She requested the 1984 transfer file. Inside was a short agreement between Martin Hale and Thomas. The property had been transferred for $1, but the price wasn't what mattered. There was a condition attached to the transfer. The enclosed storage room and all materials contained within it are to remain undisturbed. Evelyn read it twice, then a third time. Thomas hadn't simply bought a cheap house. He had agreed to preserve something Samuel had deliberately left behind. And suddenly her father's strange warning made sense. He hadn't told her not to open the door. He had warned her not to destroy the wall. That was different. Evelyn returned home and looked at the room again. This time she wasn't searching it for a secret. She was searching it for evidence. The entrance had been deliberately concealed behind the workshop shelving. The shelves were anchored into the wall. Beneath the workbench, she found a contractor's receipt. Samuel Reed had paid a local carpenter to construct the room. The date was October 21st, 1979. 7 days after the accident. The description was simple. Enclosed storage room with concealed entrance. So the photograph had been right. Samuel built it. But knowing who built the room only made the question harder. Why? Evelyn went back through the factory records. The safety warning said the valve needed replacement. The maintenance report claimed it had been repaired. The repair invoice was missing. The inspection record listed one machine number. The next production report listed another. Then she found a payroll authorization. Frank Delaney had signed for continued operation on October 13th. At first, Evelyn thought the signature was Samuel's. She found an old document bearing Samuel's known signature and compared them. They didn't match. The authorization belonged to Frank, and the page showed signs that something had been changed. Evelyn looked at the date, October 13th, the day before the accident. She had been asking the wrong question, not, why did Samuel build the room? But, what had happened to the records after the accident? That changed the way she searched. She stopped looking for one perfect document. Instead, she compared records created by different people at different times. The safety warning, the maintenance report, the payroll authorization, the production log, the inspection records. They didn't agree. On October 12th, the warning was issued. On October 13th, the equipment was supposedly repaired. On October 13th, Frank authorized continued operation. On October 14th, the valve failed. 2 workers died, but the repair invoice never appeared. The machine number on the maintenance report didn't match the machine identified in the original warning, and one inspection record had clearly been altered. None of those facts, by themselves, established who caused the accident. But together, they changed the story. The surviving record suggested that the investigation had reduced a complicated chain of decisions to one man, and the surviving evidence suggested that version was incomplete. Evelyn kept going. Then she found another photograph. It showed Samuel standing outside the hidden room while it was still being constructed. Thomas stood beside him. On the back, Thomas had written, "He asked me to keep this until Daniel was ready." Evelyn recognized the name. Daniel Reed, Samuel's son, 16 years old when the accident happened. She searched the old newspapers. One article mentioned that Daniel had found something in his father's desk 2 days before the accident, a safety warning. He had taken it to Samuel. Samuel had carried it to the factory. Then the warning disappeared from the official file. 2 days later, the equipment failed. Evelyn stopped reading. For years, she had heard the same version of the story. Samuel received the warning. Samuel failed to act. 2 workers died. Samuel was responsible. But the records in the hidden room told her something different. Samuel had received the warning. The equipment had continued operating. Frank had signed the authorization. The supposed repair could not be independently supported, and the original warning had disappeared. Still, one question remained. If Samuel had evidence that the official story was incomplete, why hadn't he fought harder to clear his name? Evelyn found the answer in Thomas's old notebook. It wasn't a diary. It was a record of decisions. One entry read, "Daniel believes he caused the deaths." Another, "He thinks if he had pushed his father harder, the machine would have been shut down." Then, "Samuel will not tell him what happened to the warning." Evelyn turned the page. There was another sentence. "I told Samuel the truth should be released. He said not yet." Below it, "Samuel isn't afraid of losing his name. He's afraid Daniel will lose himself." Evelyn closed the notebook. Now she understood the part her father had never told her. Daniel had been 16. He had found the warning. He had brought it to his father. And after the accident, he convinced himself that bringing it wasn't enough. He should have insisted. He should have done more. He should have somehow prevented what happened. The adults around him knew better. But Samuel saw what the guilt was doing to his son, so he made a choice, a difficult one. He allowed Daniel to believe that the final responsibility had belonged to him. Samuel accepted the public blame. He became the man the town remembered, and he kept the surviving evidence hidden. Not because he wanted to erase the truth, because he believed Daniel needed time before he could hear it. Thomas hadn't agreed. That was clear from another note. "Samuel thinks Daniel needs time. I don't know how much time a man can ask the truth to wait." Evelyn read that sentence again. Her father had understood the cost of Samuel's decision. He had simply chosen to preserve the evidence anyway. The hidden room wasn't just a storage space. It was the place where Samuel had made sure the truth would survive him. But another name kept appearing in the records. Frank Delaney. Evelyn went back to the personnel files. Frank had been the factory's operations manager. He had signed the authorization allowing the equipment to remain in service. He had resigned several months after the accident. There was no disappearance, no secret fortune, no dramatic confession, just a resignation. Then Evelyn found a surviving employee statement. The worker remembered Frank repeatedly warning that shutting down the line would cost the company its biggest contract. Another record showed that the factory owner had ordered production to continue despite maintenance concerns. Frank had followed that order. That did not make Frank the sole cause of the accident, but it established his role. He had participated in the decision to keep the equipment operating. He had signed the authorization, and the surviving records indicated that the maintenance history had later been altered. The evidence pointed to something more complicated than the town had been told. Several adults knew there were maintenance concerns. Several decisions kept production moving, and after 2 men died, responsibility settled on the supervisor, whose name was already attached to the warning. Samuel. The easiest story was that he had received the warning and done nothing. The records no longer supported that simple conclusion, but they also didn't erase every mistake Samuel had made. He had chosen silence. He had chosen to let his son live with a false understanding of the past. He had done it because he believed the alternative would break Daniel. It was a decision Evelyn could understand. It wasn't a decision she could call completely right. 3 weeks later, Evelyn found Daniel Reed. He was 72 and living quietly in Ohio. When she introduced herself, he became silent. "My father knew your father," he said. "Yes." Daniel looked at the folder in her hands. "Did Thomas ever tell you about the room?" "No." He looked away. "My father once told me there was a place where the truth was safe." Evelyn opened the folder. She showed him the preserved safety warning, then the maintenance record, then the production report, then the authorization bearing Frank Delaney's signature. Finally, she placed Thomas's notebook on the table. Daniel read slowly. When he reached the entry about the warning, his hands began to shake. "I found that," he said. "I know. I was 16. I know. I gave it to my father." "Yes." Daniel looked down at the table. "The next day, those men died." He swallowed. "I spent 56 years thinking I should have done more." Evelyn didn't rush him. She let the silence remain. Then she placed one final piece of paper in front of him. Samuel's handwriting. One sentence. "If Daniel ever stops blaming himself, give him everything." Daniel stared at it. "My father knew?" "Yes." "He knew I blamed myself?" "Yes." "And he let me?" Evelyn didn't soften the answer. "Yes." Daniel closed his eyes. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then he opened them again. "He built that room for me." Evelyn shook her head. "He built it for the evidence." Daniel looked at her. "And he asked your father to keep it until I could carry it." "Yes." Daniel touched the old paper. "I thought my father spent his whole life hiding what he did." Evelyn answered quietly. "He spent his life making sure what happened couldn't disappear." Daniel looked back at the warning. "I was 16. You were. I thought it was my fault." Evelyn looked at the warning between them. "You found a warning. You gave it to your father. The adults made the decisions after that." Daniel looked down at the paper. For the first time, he had nothing to argue with. The surviving records were reviewed again. The preserved warning was authenticated. The altered maintenance record was compared with the production records. The conflicting machine numbers were compared against the surviving production records. The employee statement was checked against the records from that week. No single document solved the case. The records, taken together, did something more important. They overturned the claim that Samuel had simply received the warning and chosen to do nothing. They showed that the equipment remained in operation despite known maintenance concerns. They showed that the supposed repair could not be independently supported by the surviving paperwork. They showed that key records had been altered afterward. They did not prove that Frank alone caused the accident. They did not erase the decisions made by the factory management, and they could not bring the two workers back. But they changed what could reasonably be believed about Samuel. The old version of the story was no longer defensible. Samuel had not simply ignored the warning. His name was finally cleared of that central claim. There was no dramatic courtroom confession, no final confrontation, no villain stepping forward to explain everything. Just an old record, finally corrected. For the families of the two workers, that could not restore the years they had spent believing a simpler story. But it gave them something they had never had: a fuller account of what happened. A week later, Daniel called Evelyn. "I used to think my father left me his shame," he said. Evelyn waited. "He didn't." "What did he leave you?" Daniel looked at the documents on his desk. "A chance to stop carrying it." Several months later, Evelyn returned to her father's house. The porch had been repaired. The windows had been replaced. The yard had been cleared. The house still wasn't valuable in the way the realtor had meant, but it no longer looked abandoned. Evelyn walked into the workshop. The filing cabinet was gone. The photographs were gone. The records had been given to the people who needed them. Only the second door remained. She stood in front of it. The old words were still carved into the wood. You were never supposed to know. Evelyn opened the door. The room was empty. She thought about Samuel building it in 1979, about Thomas accepting the house in 1984, about the $1 transfer that had eventually brought the property to her. For more than 50 years, the house had passed from one person to another with the same responsibility attached to it. Evelyn looked at the empty workbench. Then she closed the door. She didn't lock it. There was no reason anymore. For 50 years, the truth had needed a room. Now it only needed someone willing to carry it forward. Some stories end with answers. The ones that matter most begin with understanding. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more untold stories. Until our next untold story, take care.